Alright, so originally I had a planned out intro that I was gonna do, but that was before I lost my fucking script, and so this is gonna be a poorly edited amalgamation of what I originally had planned. Alright, so with the recent hype of new Superman movie that came out June 2025. Wait, what the fuck you mean that's not recent? The fuck you mean it's 2026? March? Alright, so it may not be recent anymore, but with the release of Superman 2025, helmed by James Gunn, the creators of Guardians of the Galaxy, there's been this general online discourse between who is going to play who in the new DCU. People have been fan casting who they want to play Batman. People have also been wondering who's going to play The Flash. And these characters that, were in the DCEU, but now obviously need to be recasted. Especially people like The Flash, who the last guy wasn't really doing so hot. And so ideas of people like Grant Gustin, people from the TV show, people brought that up and said, well, why don't we just get Grant, the guy who played him for 9 years, to play him in the new movies? And riding on that idea, I believe that the person who should play the new Batman, who should be a part of the world's finest, we already have him casted. We already have the perfect guy for that. You know him, you love him. Of course, I'm talking about Stephen Amell. The guy who played Batman on the hit TV show, The Batarang. Wait, what do you mean Stephen Amell never played Batman? What the hell was that show called then? Arrow. Who the fuck is that? Alright, well, I'm pretty sure most people already know what Arrow, and specifically the Arrowverse, was. And for those who don't know, fuck you. But I will explain. The Arrowverse was a collection of multiple DC superhero shows that ran on the CW between the 2010s. Yeah, it ran until 2022 with the ending of The Flash, but at that point it had already fallen off massively, and people had already lost interest a lot. But in those beginning years, it was just perfect. Shit was peak. Arrow was, and honestly, throughout his whole run, was just very consistent in quality. Unlike other shows like The Flash or Supergirl, it never really had that distinct fall off. It was just generally the same quality throughout the whole show. While I'm saying that may seem like a compliment. However, this is the same show that, for some reason, gave one of their main characters, who was crippled, the ability to walk out of nowhere, and just had the bitch walk off screen to break up with Oliver. And so, it isn't by any means the best. However, Arrow and the universe around the Arrowverse was what led the online discourse into proving that DC was just the best when it came to TV shows. And of course, you had other stuff like Batman the Animated Series and the DC AMU, which Marvel doesn't have. Marvel does have animated TV shows, but not to the same level as the DCAU. And while at the time, shows like Daredevil, Luke Cage, freaking Iron Fist, they had those shows, but it wasn't quite on the same level as the Arrowverse, which I know sounds very funny looking at Arrowverse quality, but it is true. It is true. Arrow was actually pretty consistent throughout his whole run. Unlike The Flash, where the first 2 seasons were really good, and the third or fourth were alright, and then everything after that was just straight ass. However, weirdly enough, there is the grand consensus that the Arrow itself, the TV show, was actually pretty good throughout most of its run. It never really fell off to the same lengths as the other shows, being very well received throughout its original run. I'm only really going to touch on the first 2 seasons of it, because that's the one I myself have watched. I have seen The Flash in its entirety, which is why I feel comfortable shitting on it to no end. However, Arrow to me was one of those shows that I never really cared about. Of course, I still would see him in other shows, which, mind you, is why I was confused as hell seeing Arrow in the pilot, because it ends as someone who never saw Arrow, it ends on a really fucking bizarre note, because then all you see is, at the end of it, Barry going up to some random guy and being like, hey, I'm gonna do what you do. And then him giving advice. And I was just watching that as a young kid thinking, who the fuck are you? My main goal in this video is not to trash on Arrow and all the classic cliches that come with a show that was primarily aired on the CW, with all the teen drama cliches and melodrama that they have. However, I guess my main goal here is to see, is the Arrow really just a clone of Batman? And why I think that this show receives way too much flack from people who just don't understand the Arrow. I feel like the best way to start is by comparing Oliver Queen to his comic book origins. It's often a running joke that goes between fans of DC that Oliver Queen is just a Batman clone. And while in their origins, that is literally what he was conceived to be, Oliver Queen has since grown into his own character with his own set of justice and beliefs that is much more different than, I don't kill, I'm rich, I was definitely on the island. Although I suppose in Oliver's case, it was a very different fucking island for him. You know what, I guess it makes sense now that why Slade was on the island to begin with in the show. In more recent years, Oliver Queen has been to be as much of a bleeding heart liberal as you can get. In the comics, Oliver is somebody who fights for the working man, who believes the most evil you can be is somebody who stands by and watches oppression as it happens instead of stepping in to help. It's shown on multiple occasions that Oliver isn't a cop. He's not somebody who beats down on the poor beggar for stealing a loaf of bread just for trying to eat. That's not who Ollie is. Oliver is all of the things that people say Batman is. The philanthropist, the person who gives to charity, the person who uses their wealth for good instead of fucking around beating mentally ill clowns to death. Oliver in the comics is that guy. And it's only when you compare the comic book Oliver to the Ollie we see in Arrow that you really see how much of a far cry this Oliver is. In Arrow, at least in the beginning, he's not doing what he's doing to help people, to make the city better. It's more out of a sense of somebody else's mission, somebody else's dying words. Where his dad, in his final moments, gave Oliver what can only be described as the Epstein files and said, hey, if you ever go back, I need you to take down these people. And while it does ultimately make a very narratively satisfying story, it ultimately leads to this Oliver not being the same one from the comics. Comic book Oliver was somebody who sought to destroy the corruptive system, making everyday people's lives worse. Versus the show Oliver, which is his main criticism by people in the show itself is for only going after the systems of crime and not going after the root sources of it. It's not a story about rich white boy learns the error of his ways and tries to do something better with the position he has, but rather of a story of a pretty white boy who learned how to fight and now wants to take down everyone in the Epstein files. And don't get me wrong, that is a very valid admission, and that is ultimately morally correct. However, it doesn't give off the same meaning and the same genuine altruistic goals that Ollie in the comics had. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying comic book Oliver was God. I'm not saying he never did anything wrong. However, the way that the show chooses to characterize Oliver makes him somebody who I'm pretty sure comic book Oliver just wouldn't like. And I guess it makes sense because the writers didn't really want to write Oliver as Oliver. The tone of the story necessitated it to write Oliver in a different way entirely. Because remember, this is the late 2000s, early 2010s. We have everything serious. No, Oliver can't just wear a normal fucking mask over his face to protect his identity. He has to put oil paint all over it until the Flash, for some fucking reason, makes him his first mask. The Arrowverse suffers from something that a lot of superhero media from the 2000s suffered from, which was they couldn't let their characters just be the characters. It's kind of like the X-Men movies with the black leather. they were scared that people wouldn't take it seriously if they adapted characters from the books. And so they had to make it overly serious and very entirely different. Just so that your oldie ass grandpa couldn't come into the room and call you a bitch for watching a show made for kids. It's not for kids. We have sex and court case drama and stupid ass melodrama between the characters so that you can think you're watching something more deep than it actually is. And so, if this Oliver isn't really that much close to the comic book Oliver, then who is he more closer to? Is he a Batman ripoff? I did touch on this earlier. However, the main conceit from generally most people who watched it was that Oliver Queen, the main character of the show, felt too much like Batman, too much like Bruce Wayne, and the behaviors that we often associated with Batman and the way he acted. And just to be real simple, I don't want to say that he is a beat-for-beat clone. However, the writers clearly did not want to write for Oliver Queen. They wanted to write for Batman. And due to the whole legal stuff around the rights that with Batman in the movies, and because Warner Brothers thinks you're a fucking idiot that can't tell the difference between movie Batman and TV show Batman, this is why they had to do an Arrowverse show to begin with, because we didn't have Batman. And I don't know if you know this, but Batman is a very popular character. However, I would like to make the case that Arrow, Oliver Queen in the show isn't a full clone of Batman. For one, Ollie doesn't really have the same intelligence that we often attribute to Bruce Wayne. While he's not a dumbass to be sure, right, he still does do a lot of detective work. That's not really done by him exactly, it's mainly done by Team Arrow. Team Arrow itself shows how different Ollie really is from most Batman adaptations. Oftentimes, when it comes to movies, TV shows, and other forms of media like that, they often like to portray Batman as just a very isolated figure. I work alone. I don't need help. Which, in and of itself, is just wrong. Like, Batman is he's the pioneer of sidekicks and extra characters. He was really the guy who pioneered the idea of having a team to begin with. And I guess Felicity Smoke, who later becomes the main love interest of Oliver, she is kind of just a ripoff of Oracle. Not Barbara Gordon, but Oracle, as in the guy in the chair who is on comms helping out the hero. But I feel that's just it. Arrow might share some superficial qualities with how people view Batman. However, the way it characterizes its characters is very different. Like with Felicity. She's not a Barbara Gordon ripoff. She's her own character. While there is that weird-ass ship between Bruce Wayne and Barbara Gordon that people were like, they're both Bat characters, they should fuck. That isn't what's happening between Oliver and Felicity. Oliver and Felicity are their own whole can of worms that I'll go into for a second. But Ollie is his own character. While his motivations are inspired by vengeance from the death of a family, from the death of a parental figure, his origin story and the conspiracy around his family and who they really were is something that just isn't what you would see in a Batman story. And listen, I feel like while I'm talking, I start to feel like, but, however, while Batman also did have the Court of Owls, which was a conspiracy around his parents, it wasn't what motivated him to become Batman. Unlike with Oliver, where that's his origin story, that's how he became the Arrow to begin with. The island plotline is something I'd like to touch on specifically, because it is genuinely something that I felt really invested in, and something that I really wanted to talk about specifically while writing this video. It does something that you don't really see in a lot of prequels or, flashbacks, where a lot of the time you start to lose interest because it's just this sort of, I already know what's gonna happen, why should I care? However, in Arrow, it's really so just very investing into you. It makes you just really care about what's happening. Well, in most other forms, like in most other flashbacks, I don't give a damn. I don't give a like with Star Wars, with a lot of the prequels, You already know what's gonna happen, you know? Like with the Black Widow movie that's supposed to be set after Civil War. I've already seen this bitch get murdered and chucked off a mountain. Why do I care about this story? This would have been more interesting to see before now, you know? But when it comes to the flashbacks, it really gets you to care about what's happening then. And especially during season 2, when you still see Slade Wilson working with Oliver, juxtaposition with Oliver clearly stating that him and Slade have a very rough history. It's just very, I don't know, it's just good, basically. The flashbacks work to flesh out Oliver, and like I keep saying, it does something that most other forms of media don't do, where it makes you want to see something change. It makes you want to see what you already know is going to happen be different. Anyways, enough about that. Back to the Batman comparisons. Like with what I just said about Slade, Oliver Arrow tends to take a lot from Batman villains. Like with Slade Wilson or Ra's al Ghul, people whose main claim to fame is from Batman specifically, you know? But the reason I like them specifically is because they have an entirely different relation to Oliver that they would with Batman. Like with Slade Wilson or, you know, Deathstroke. Due to the fact that we already see Slade beforehand, it really makes you care more about him as a character and more about him as a villain, and it really shows an entirely different dynamic that you usually wouldn't see in a different Batman media. Instead of a simple mercenary hired to kill Bruce Wayne, or a grown-ass man trying to go for vengeance over the people who killed his kid, there's an already established bond between him and Oliver. And that's why you care when you see them face off. That's why it's very badass when you see Slade arrive at Oliver's house. I feel like the main important thing that is often forgotten with discourse around Arrow and the whole universe is that these aren't the definitive versions of the characters that we see in other forms of media. The best way to look at these are as Elseworlds, you know? Just another folder in the pantheon of this character. A different universe with a different story. That's very easy to say with a character like Barry, where he is among one of the most popular heroes among DC. He's going to have different adaptations in different versions of him. But I do like the way that the show goes about it. Like with the title. They deliberately do not call him the Green Arrow. It's right what it says on the title. He's not the Green Arrow, he's Arrow. Like what they call him in season 1. He's the Hood, the vigilante. I like that because it shows that this isn't the same guy. And sure, most likely the reason they called it Arrow wasn't because of anything to do with that, but mainly because of the fact they believed just calling him Green Arrow would have been less dramatic, I suppose. Would have made him seem less serious, which is just fucking crazy. I can't imagine any modern day studio thinking that calling something green would have made it embarrassing or something. It's weird. But you know, I feel like the main reason Arrow is hated is because it's put on the same standard of this is the adaptation. This is supposed to be the definitive version of of Arrow, which it just isn't. And it's when you stop comparing him to what he could have been to, you know, the comic book character, and you just accept it for what it is, that you really just start to see that it's a good show. This version isn't Green Arrow, it isn't Batman, he's Arrow. He's the Hood. He's the vigilante. So while I am making fun of the show, and while I am joking about, like, it's, of course, a product of the time, that's not to say that it didn't have fantastical elements. Like in season 2, they just confirmed that Slade has superpowers. And this is before the particle accelerator incident that happens in The Flash. This is before all that. They just confirmed, yeah, superheroes, like, fantastical abilities just do exist in this world. In the show, Oliver oftentimes puts on this, like, Playboy cover, this aesthetic, basically ripping the thing Batman does, pretending to be a Playboy sex haver for the public image, to cover his superhero identity, pretending to be a straight dumbass, and no one would believe he is a superhero at night. You know, I could sit here and do this all day, draw parallels between show Oliver and Bruce Wayne, but it's really just the way that the show chooses to go about his characteristics, because the show uses stuff that, you know, from Batman. They use villains, they use certain fucking character traits from most adaptations of Bruce, but they use that to go in a different way. They use that to characterize him differently than they would for Batman or comic era. It's really just in the execution. Real quick, I just want to talk about the show itself further, because I really do love Arrow. It is just really good. I was in the middle of watching it for this video, but it got nuked off of Netflix, and I don't have the money to buy another streaming service, so I'm not watching it. But the Arrowverse itself does hold a very special place in my heart, because it's something I watched a lot throughout my developmental years. Something I still watch from time to time, just out of nostalgia. I remember watching The Flash as it came out, season to season, and it was genuinely one of my favorite shows, and is the reason that I'm so invested in superhero media and DC in general. And trust me, there for a while there, it was not easy to be a fan of DC. Like I have mentioned, and like I will continue to mention throughout this video, is that it is a product of its time when it comes to just the general cliches that are in it, between the melodrama with, I'm just gonna say Black Canary and Oliver, and it is just a weird change that they decided to go with their own OC to be the love interest of Oliver, and not like why. That's one of the changes that I'll just never be down for, because what do you mean? What do you mean you made a Black Canary into two different characters, and then you killed off who was supposed to be the actual Black Canary in favor for the sister that just never, like, what is this? Is this so? That's the one thing which is very convoluted and unnecessary to do. Also, what the fuck do you mean you made the original Black Canary, you made Dinah Lance just a side character you barely even see, in favor for the dad that isn't even in the comics? But, you know, I do like the parallels between Black Canary in season 1 and her dad, where they became the cop that is very against the vigilante and thinks he needs to be taken down, versus the lawyer who thinks that he's doing a good job and works with him, versus season 2 where the dynamic is just flipped. That's something I really liked. The villains are also just pretty good threats. I like how they weren't afraid to just reuse a character. It's something you see like in a lot of recent TV shows, where they'll introduce one character, but you can't use them until the season after, because you don't have enough episodes. But, you know, this is cable, baby. This is where you actually have the chance to flesh out your characters and really build on what is already there. Like with Huntress, who I'm pretty sure is more of a Batman character than anything, but I just love the direction they went with Huntress. It was really like her second episode in season 1, where she got brought back to be the clinging ex-girlfriend. That shit was undeniably peak right there. Like with somebody else, like Deadshot, where in this version he's actually white, but they remove him from his original purpose as, I'm pretty sure, like a Batman villain, and they tie him to this universe's John Diggle, you know, Green Lantern, where there's more of a significance to him being here, instead of just, again, a random merc. We also just, like, oftentimes there's just like this clowning on the budget that was for these CW shows, and, you know, they didn't have a lot of money. Like, I saw a video from Andy something where he was just ranking the costumes from Smallville, and it was just clowning on all of them, because, you know, you don't have a lot of money, right? But for what they had, they actually did a lot with what they had, with the money they had, with, like, the crossovers and everything. The Crisis on Infinite Earths event was genuinely really good. It does get annoying trying to watch all the episodes, especially the way I'm watching it on Netflix, where you have to go to, like, each individual show just to watch it like the way it's meant to be. But it is really good. Like, genuinely one of the best events to come from there. Also, the choreography that came with, like, the fight where all the superheroes came together, that is genuinely on the same level, if not better than the Civil War airport fight. And I'm saying that specifically to clown on the Civil War airport fight, but still, I just really love all of Arrow, you know? And something I like about the Arrowverse shows is that they're not afraid to make their main characters seem unlikable. And I don't know if that's fully intentional, you know, like with the other seasons of The Flash, where after a certain while, Barry just became a complete dumbass. You know, he got lobotomized. They started leaning into his more unlikable traits, or just not have him there at all. But with, you know, Oliver, they're not afraid to point out his character flaws, to have him sleep around, to show he's not the best guy. Even with him undeniably being a hero, they're still not afraid to question his methods, to say, is it really okay to put an arrow through a man's chest? The arrow specifically is something I really like about his character, because it's different than like a lot of how we see in lots of American media, where we just see somebody get gunned down and think, oh, he survived that, it's fine. But like with Arrow, you actively see an arrow through a man's chest. You have to be faced with how visceral of an image that is, and it's the question of, is this correct? Is he doing the right thing? Is this moral in this situation? And of course, the way it's portrayed in Arrow, most of the time it is. You know, going after rich billionaires, fuck them, kill all of them, right? Or when he's going after just thugs that are killing people, they're killing people. These niggas have powers, kill them. The stuff with his mom I really liked. I liked the way that the mystery unfolded in season 1, which is something that they also did in The Flash, with just the best villain played by Tom Cavanaugh playing the Reverse Flash, where, you know, he of course became worse after the first few seasons, which was the same thing for all of them, but still, right? These first seasons oftentimes have the best mysteries, have the best plots in general, and I like the way that they ended off with Oliver, making him to be, you know, the protector of the multiverse, or the universe, whatever's up with that. I like the fact that Arrow got to end, in general, you know, and even some plot lines, bro, like with John Diggle showing up in multiple different TV shows, like showing up in the final season of The Flash, or I believe in Lois and Clark, or Superman Lois, sorry, which again is weird as fuck to like retroactively make the one black guy you have named John into John Stewart, but it's fine. But to not give him the fucking ring, he has the ring. He like, why just let him wear it, dude? Come on. Arrow is allowed to show that like his character, like he's flawed. You know, something that like later seasons of The Flash just didn't do, right? It was just also something that made those characters that they were supposed to be very likable. But while you're watching, you're thinking, this guy's a fucking asshole. These guys never support Barry. These guys are pieces of shit. Fuck them. Because the story is showing as all their actions to be virtuous. They never question their heroes. I like that Arrow was allowed to end and wasn't forced to artificially go on longer than it needed to. Like The Flash, that went on all the way until season 9, when it really didn't need to do that. And The Flash that just ended with a whimper. Arrow got to end with the glory of Crisis. I could really go on about this topic all day, but my final thoughts is that Arrow works best while looking at it in a vacuum, instead of comparing it to what it could have been, instead of comparing it to what other stuff was, like I'm doing all throughout this video. It's best looking at it just as a show, just as an adaptation. Sorry, not adaptation, but you know, just as a show, because it actually is good. It's a good show. And then on to other semi-good shows. Ultimately, this isn't the Green Arrow, this is just Arrow. And that, my friends, is what I'd like this message to be. Arrow isn't bad because it's not comic accurate, and I feel like that's something that a lot of us tend to focus on in the comic book community, in the superhero community. It's always, is it comic accurate? Therefore, it's good. And it can just be good on its own. A lot of times people look at bad stuff and they're thinking, well, it's not comic accurate, that's why it's mid. Well, no, it's mid, you know? But I've been Dr. Sergito, and in case I don't see you tomorrow, good afternoon, good morning, and good night. Bye-bye!